For over 4 years, Paris has been a stinging rebuke to the free world. Suddenly it becomes a magnet. While the shackled and stunned giant seemed to be asleep, everyone somehow put up with its absence. But as soon as the German front was broken in Normandy, the French capital immediately found itself at the centre of strategic plans in the heart of politics. The plans of the commanders-in-chief, the calculations of governments, the manoeuvres of amateurs, the excited feelings of the people, everything focused on this city. Paris was coming back to life. How much might now be changed? First of all, Paris, if it is not prevented, will decide the question of what will be the power in France. Everyone is convinced that if de Gaulle on arrival in the capital will not be put before the fait accompli, the people will be in favour of his staying in power. Therefore, all those who, whether at home or abroad, harbour hopes of preventing such an outcome, or at least of making success incomplete or disputed, will try, regardless of which camp they belong to take advantage of the last-minute release and create a situation that will embarrass me, perhaps even paralyse me. But the nation has made its choice, and a wave of public feeling will sweep away these attempts. One of them was made by Pierre Naval. In those days of August, when I was informed of the decisive successes achieved in Normandy, of the landings in Provence, of the battles being fought by the forces of the internal resistance, of the impending uprising in Paris, I also learned of an intrigue planned by a man tainted by collaborationism. His plan was to convene a National Assembly in Paris in 1940, and on its basis to create a so-called government of unity, which would meet the Allies and de Gaulle in Paris as a legitimate body. Thus the ground would have been knocked out from under the general's feet. Of course, he would have been given a place in the executive, and if necessary, he would even have been placed at the head of the executive. But having debunked him morally and deprived him of the support of the people, he would soon have been disposed of by the tried and tested means. The bestowal of unneeded honours, increasing obstruction by the parties, and finally general opposition on the pretext that, on the one hand, he was incapable of governing the country, and, on the other, that he was aspiring to be a dictator. As for Laval himself, having secured the accession to power of the parliamentarians, a favour which the latter would certainly not forget, although they would be obliged to condemn him on principle, he would stand aside until all was forgotten and circumstances changed in his favour. But to carry such a plan into effect, the help of the most heterogeneous elements was necessary. Above all, it required the participation of a prominent figure, sufficiently authoritative for Parliament, a figure known for his opposition to the policy of Pétain, sufficiently respected abroad, otherwise it would be difficult to pass it off as a restoration of the Republican regime. Marriott seemed quite suitable for this purpose. All that remained was to persuade him. We had to take into account the fact that the new power must be recognized by the Allies after they entered Paris. And besides, it was necessary that the Germans should also agree, for after all their troops were still in the capital. And finally, it is necessary to obtain the consent of the Marshal, otherwise the occupiers will not give permission. The Allies will not recognize such a government. The parliamentarians will refuse to appear, and as for the resistance, it in any case with indignation will refuse to recognize such a government. At the beginning of August, Laval may have had the impression that he would get the necessary support through Anfire, a friend of Heriot's who was connected with Allen Dulles's services in Bern and who helped the Americans to keep in touch with the President of the Chamber. He found out that Washington would look favourably on a plan to get ahead of or eliminate de Gaulle. With the Germans, the project of the head of the government met with an equally favourable attitude. Betz, Ribbentrop and others, of course, decided that it would be much better if after the liberation of France in Paris will be the executive power, stained with the Vichy brand, rather than a government without fear and reproach. And so, with the consent of the occupiers, Laval goes to Marieville, where Heriot is kept, and persuades the latter to go together to Paris to convene there the Parliament of 1940. Pétain makes it clear that he, too, is ready to arrive there. I must say that in spite of the support which Laval seemed to have received on all sides, this idea seemed to me even then a desperate and futile step. For if his attempt had succeeded, I would have had to submit. But nothing, not even pressure from the Allies, could compel me to recognize the 1940 Assembly as a body entitled to speak on behalf of France. Moreover, knowing the forces which the resistance intended to set in motion throughout the country and to summon to life in Paris, I had no doubt that Laval's scheme would be nipped in the bud. As early as July 14, impressive demonstrations began in the suburbs of the capital. On that day, The tricolour banner was raised in various places. People sang the Marseillaise, walked through the streets shouting, "Long live de Gaulle," and in Saint-Thé, political prisoners, having agreed through the walls of the cells, hung flags in all the windows despite the possibility of severe reprisals, chased away the jailers and sang patriotic songs throughout the neighbourhood. On August 10, the railroad workers stopped work. On August 15, the police strike began. On August 18, the postal and telegraph workers were to strike. Any minute now the news could come that street fighting had begun, and the illusions of the parliamentarians would inevitably come to an end. But the other plan, the one by which certain political elements in the resistance intended to come to power, seemed to me to have a better chance of success. I knew that these people wanted to take advantage of the general excitement, perhaps even the state of anarchy which the struggle in the capital would cause, and would try to seize the levers of government before I could take them. We are talking, of course, about the intentions of the communists. If they succeeded in leading the uprising and thus taking Paris into their hands, it would cost them nothing to set up a de facto government in which they would play a commanding role. They intended to capitalize on the confusion surrounding the fighting, to attract to their side the National Council of the Resistance, many of whose members might be tempted by the promise of power, to take advantage of the sympathy felt for them by many people from all walks of life for the persecutions they had suffered, the losses they had suffered, and the courage they had shown. They could exploit the anxiety caused by the absence of any real social force, and by playing a double game, by flaunting their attachment to General de Gaulle, become the leaders of an uprising like a kind of commune that would proclaim a republic, restore order, restore justice, and to top it all off, sing only the Marseillaise and fly only tricolour flags. On my arrival in the capital, I would find there that people's government. It would decorate my forehead with a laurel wreath, offer to take the place previously allotted to me in its composition, and the trap would be slammed. And then the players would play the game, alternating boldness with caution, infiltrating, under cover of purges, all the links of the state apparatus, working public opinion by means of clever dissemination of the necessary information, and gradually getting rid of their initial allies, until at last the so-called dictatorship of the proletariat was established. That political projects of this kind would arise as the fighting expanded seemed to me inevitable. That an uprising in the capital would for some be linked to an attempt to establish the power of the Third International had long been known to me. Nevertheless, I believed that the forces of France should show themselves in arms in Paris before the Allies got there, that the people themselves should contribute to the defeat of the occupiers, that the liberation of the capital should have the character of a military and at the same time of a national operation. That is why I decided to take the risk and encourage the uprising in every possible way, without objecting to the participation of any elements capable of causing it. I must say that I felt myself strong enough to guide the matter to a favourable outcome, having taken the appropriate measures in advance, having prepared in time for the entry of a large French unit into the city. I intended to arrive there myself to take on the enthusiasm of a liberated Paris. The government had done everything necessary to ensure that the command of the regular troops stationed in Paris was entrusted to loyal men. As early as July, Charles Louis, prefect of Corsica, was appointed prefect of police. After 2 unsuccessful attempts, he finally succeeded in entering Paris on August 17, which was very opportune, as the police had just taken over the prefecture and he had to assume his duties. And General Airy was to be at the head of the Republican Guard, the Paris Fire Brigade, the National Guard, and the Gendarmerie, all of which would undoubtedly welcome the leader appointed by de Gaulle. But owing to the circumstances, the case was different in the guerrilla detachments which sprang up in the different quarters. They were naturally under the command of chiefs, whom they themselves had chosen from among themselves, and the communists endeavoured, sometimes directly and sometimes under the cover of the Front National, to make sure that they were their own men. The party exerted pressure for higher positions through the National Council of Resistance. Military matters were handled by a council-appointed action committee, the so-called COMAC, which consisted of 3 members, including Kriegel, Valremont and Villon. The title of Chief of Staff of the Internal Resistance Forces was assigned to Malray Juinville in the above-mentioned way, after the Germans had arrested Colonel de Jussieu. Roltanguy was appointed commander of the armed forces of the Isle-de-France. In short, judging from these appointments, it seemed that the leadership of the fighting was in the hands of the communists. But these were mere titles, far from signifying what is commonly meant by them. In fact, The men who wore them were in no way directing operations. Instead of issuing orders and verifying their fulfillment according to military norms, they would act by proclamations or individual acts, which were always of a limited nature. Indeed, the guerrillas, whose numbers would reach at most 25,000 armed men, were separate groups, and each of them acted not so much in accordance with instructions from above as in accordance with local conditions, not going beyond its own neighbourhood where it had shelters. Besides, Colonel de Marguerite, an extremely experienced officer, was at the head of the internal armed forces of Paris and the suburbs, and Generals Rivière and Bloch d'Assault were respectively advisers to the Commerce and the Front National. Finally, Chaban Delmas, the government's military delegate, who arrived in Paris on August 16, having previously received instructions in London from General Koenig, was at the centre of everything. Dexterous and shrewd, he alone was able to keep in touch with abroad. He was aware of all proposals and intentions, and at times he had to engage in long and unpleasant negotiations to keep the council and the committees from taking one step or another. Among other things, General de Gaulle and his government had a representative in Paris. This function was performed by Alexandre Parodi. On August 15, in the interest of strengthening his authority, I appointed him minister delegate to the territories not yet liberated. Since he spoke on my behalf, his words were listened to, and by virtue of his high moral qualities, conscientiousness, complete disinterestedness, absolute honesty, he immediately became above all this game of passions. Besides having served in the civil service for a long time, he was also distinguished by his experience, which gave him considerable prestige in the confusion that reigned around him. The policy he pursued was in line with his character. He willingly conceded in small things, but with a gentle persistence defended the main thing. Recognizing the demands of ideology and the claims of individuals, he tried to avoid unpleasant consequences, so that when I arrived in Paris, I did not find myself in a situation where the game has already made all the big stakes. It must be said that Georges Bidault, president of the National Council of the Resistance, coordinated his actions with Parodi and helped to avoid the worst, skillfully combining for his part the tactics of bold statements with cautious actions. As for the administrative organs, they all recognized the authority of my representative and of those whom I had appointed to head certain departments. Thus Parodi would, without the slightest difficulty, enter Matainen at the proper moment. The secretaries general would take possession of the ministries. Lizy, the prefect of police, would take possession of the place Bussiers, and Florate, the prefect of the Seine, would sit in the chair formerly occupied by Buffet. The government apparatus, established in advance while still in Algiers, would immediately place its landmarks in Paris, as it had previously placed them in the dominions of France. On the afternoon of August 18th, I left Algiers in my usual airplane, driven by Marmier. General Juin and some of my companions followed me in a flying fortress, which the Americans had strongly recommended to us on the ground that the crew knew well the route and the train to be flown. The first stage was Casablanca. I intended to fly from there the same night to land the next day at Malpertuis near St. Lou, but there were malfunctions in the mechanisms of the flying fortress on the way, which had to be eliminated. In addition, the Allied missions, citing the existence of passages and the rules of air travel, insisted that we make a landing at Gibraltar before flying along the coasts of Spain and France. This meant a day's delay. On the 19th I left Casablanca. Significant crowds lined the streets I travelled along to the airfield. Their faces were tense. They had evidently guessed the purpose of my journey, though it was kept secret. No greetings, no exclamations of bravo, but all hats were off, all waving their hands, watching without taking their eyes off. This ardent and at the same time silent greeting was for me as if a proof of the support that the crowd was ready to give me at the decisive moment. I was excited. The resident general seated next to me was no less excited than I was. "What a fate is in store for you," Gabriel Pouot said to me at Gibraltar while we were dining at the governor's. Allied officers appeared and said that the flying fortress could not fly, and that it was not safe for my Lockheed airplane to appear without escort in the skies of Normandy, as it was in no way armed. In short, the most prudent thing to do was to postpone my departure, without questioning the sincerity of the motives which led them to give me such advice. I, however, thought it prudent not to follow it. At the appointed hour I left on board my airplane. Soon the flying fortress also departed. On Sunday, August 20, about 8 o'clock, I landed at Malpertuis. I was met by Koenig, as well as Culeus, Commissioner of the Republic in Normandy, and an officer sent by Eisenhower. I went first of all to the headquarters of the Commander-in-Chief of the Allied forces. On the way, Koenig outlined to me the situation in Paris, of which he knew from the reports of Paradis, Chaban-Delmas, Louise, and from the reports brought by messengers. Thus I learned that the police, on strike for 3 days at the dawn of August 19, had occupied the prefecture and opened fire on the Germans. That almost everywhere partisan detachments were doing the same. That the ministry buildings were in the hands of detachments formed by our delegation. That the resistance forces, sometimes not without a fight, are occupying town halls in the city and suburbs, as was the case, for example, at Montreal and later at Neuilly. That the enemy, busy evacuating his institutions, has so far offered no serious resistance, but that his columns of troops must soon pass through Paris, and therefore reprisals may be expected at any moment. As for the political situation, Naval, as it appears, has not been able to achieve anything, and in Vichy from day to day expected the removal of the Marshal by the Germans. Eisenhower, after listening to my congratulations on the brilliant successes of the Allied forces, outlined to me the situation. 3rd Army Patton pursuing, at the head of the Army Group Bradley, the enemy 2 columns will cross the Seine. One of these columns, advancing north of Paris, will approach Mantoue. The other, advancing south of Paris, will reach Melun. In Patton's rear, General Hodges, commander of the 1st U.S. Army, will regroup the forces that have finished clearing the enemy area of Orne. To the left of Bradley Army Group Montgomery, pushing stubbornly resisting Germans, slowly advancing to ruin. But on the right, empty, and Eisenhower decided to take advantage of this and move Patton in Lorraine. Let him get farther away, as far as fuel supply will allow. Finally, from the south will approach the armies of Delatter and Patch, and join the general ensemble. The plan of the Commander-in-Chief seemed to me quite logical, except for one circumstance, which I was extremely worried. No one went to Paris. I expressed to Eisenhower my surprise and dismay at this. From the strategic point of view, I said, it is not quite clear to me why you, having crossed the Seine at Melun, Mantes, Rouen in short, in several places are not going to cross it to Paris. Besides, it is the centre of all communications, which you will need later and which it is important to restore as soon as possible. If it were any other place than the capital of France, you would not be obliged to take my opinion into consideration, since, of course, you are in charge of all operations. But the French government has a substantial interest in the fate of Paris. I must therefore intervene and ask you to send troops there. It goes without saying that in the first place there should be sent to the 2nd French Armoured Division. Eisenhower was unable to hide his confusion. I had the feeling that deep down he shared my point of view and would be happy to send Leclerc in Paris, but for reasons other than strategic reasons could not yet do it. In short, he explained to me this delay by the circumstance that a battle in the capital might cause serious destruction and great loss of life among the population. He could not, however, contradict me when I remarked that the tactic of waiting would be justifiable if nothing were going on in Paris, but that it could not be considered acceptable now, since the Patriots were already fighting the enemy there, and that it might lead to all sorts of disturbance. He told me only that the resistance forces are getting into the fighting too soon. Why too early? I asked. After all, your troops had already approached the scene. As a result of the conversation, the Commander-in-Chief assured me that he would soon order an attack on Paris, although he could not yet give the exact date, and that the operation would be carried out by Leclerc's division. I took note of his promise, adding, however, that I consider it a matter of national importance, and therefore, if the Commander-in-Chief of the Allied forces will be too slow, ready to send to Paris himself 2nd Armoured Division. The uncertainty of Eisenhower's assurances led me to believe that the military command, in some measure, tied the hands of the political intrigues Laval, which looked favourably on Roosevelt, and for the success of which it was necessary to keep Paris from upheaval. These plans the resistance undoubtedly put an end to by beginning the fighting, but it was to be some time before Washington would agree to recognize this. My conjectures were confirmed when I learned that Leclerc's division, hitherto attached to Patton's army, had 3 days ago been attached to Hodges's army, placed in direct dependence on General Guerreau, commander of the 5th American Corps, and was being held at Argentan, exactly fearful lest it might itself move toward the Eiffel Tower. In addition, I found out that the famous agreement on the relations between the Allied forces and the French administration although it had already been concluded weeks ago between Algiers, Washington, and London, had not yet been signed by Koenig and Eisenhower because the latter had not yet been authorized to do so. What else could explain this delay than the great intrigues that kept the White House from making a decision? When Dewey arrived at the Commander-in-Chief's headquarters, he came, as a result of his observations, to the same conclusions as I did. At a time of the most brilliant successes of the Allied armies, when American troops were displaying valor worthy of all praise, such apparent obstinacy on the part of Washington's politicians was extremely distressing to me, but the reward was not far off. A tremendous wave of universal enthusiasm and excitement swept me up as I entered Cherbourg and carried me through Coutances, Avranches, and Fugères to Rennes. Among the ruins of ruined towns and wiped-out villages, the inhabitants gathered in my path, tumultuously displaying their feelings. Flags and banners were displayed in all the surviving windows. The surviving bells rang out in full force. Streets, riddled with craters, were decorated with flowers and immediately took on a festive appearance. Mayors made heartfelt speeches ending in sobs. Then I spoke a few words, but they were not words of pity, which no one needed, but words of hope and pride, which ended with the Marseillaise, sung with me by the whole crowd. The contrast between the ardour of the souls and the desolation all around was truly heart-rending. But enough of that. France must live, if she can bear suffering. In the evening, accompanied by André Le Troqueur, minister delegate to the liberated territories, Generals Dewey and Koenig and Gaston Payewiski, I arrived at the prefecture of Rennes. Victor Legorge, commissioner of the Republic in Brittany, Bernard Cornugentius, prefect of the Department of Isle and Vilaine, General Alliard, commander of the military district, introduced me to their subordinates. Administrative life was steadily reviving. So was tradition. I made my way to the town hall, where Mayor Yves Millon, surrounded by members of the municipality, fellow members of the resistance movement and prominent citizens, asked me to reopen the Golden Book of Brittany's capital to bind the chain of time. In the rain, in the coming dusk, I addressed the crowd gathered outside the town hall. The next day, August 21, news came from Paris. I learned, among other things, of the final collapse of Laval's attempt. That Heriot, warned by representatives of the resistance, felt that a storm was coming, and seeing the confusion of the Vichy ministers, the highest Parisian officials and the German ambassador, did not let himself be persuaded and refused to convene the so-called National Assembly. Moreover, his meetings with parliamentarians, in particular with Anatole de Monzy, showed him that these latter, being under the impression of tragic events so close to them, such as the murder of Georges Mandel, Genzé Maurice Sarraute by the Darnand militia, as well as the shooting of Philippe Henriot by a resistance group, were not at all eager to gather in the fraught atmosphere of Paris. In turn, the Marshal carefully weighed everything, realized that such a way will lead nowhere, and refused to come to the capital. Finally, Hitler, irritated by this intrigue, indicating that plans were already being made in anticipation of his collapse, decided to put an end to it, ordered the transfer of Laval, along with his government in Nancy, and ordered that Pétain, voluntarily or forcibly, followed them. As for the president of the chamber, he was returned to Mareville. So, on August 18, Laval, Heriot and Abetz met for the last time at a farewell breakfast at the Palace of Matignon. On August 20, the Marshal was taken away by the Germans from Vichy. So vanished into oblivion the last combination of Laval. To the very end he fought, which, this could not hide all his dexterity, was criminal, inclined by nature, and trained by the regime to view everything from a low point of view. Laval believed that, no matter how things turned out, it is important to be in power, that if there is a certain cunning can get out of any situation, that there is no event that could not be turned to his advantage, and there are no people who could not be made an obedient tool in his hands. In the catastrophe over France, he saw not only a calamity for his country, but also an opportunity to seize the reins of power and apply on a large scale his ability to collude with anyone. But a victorious Germany was not a partner with whom anything could be negotiated. For the field of action to open before Pierre Laval, it was necessary to take for granted all the disasters of France, and he did. He decided that it is possible to capitalize on the worst of the worst, to go even to the enslavement of the country, to collude with the invaders, trump horrific repression. In the name of pursuing his policy, he sacrificed the honor of the country, the independence of the state, national pride. And suddenly all of these things were revived and began to assert themselves in full voice as the enemy grew weaker. Naval made his bet, and lost. He had the courage to admit that he was responsible for what had happened. In his government, using all his inherent cunning and all his stubbornness to support what could not be supported, he was certainly trying to serve his country. Let us not deprive him of that. In the year of calamity, even those few Frenchmen who chose the path of filth did not renounce their fatherland. It was a testimony to the respect paid to France by those of her sons who had done so much wrong. It also left a loophole for pardons. The liquidation of Vichy coincided with the deployment of fighting in the capital. Reports received during my brief stay in Rennes only strengthened my desire to see the end of the crisis. True, the German command, for reasons as yet unclear, seemed reluctant to take matters to extremes, but this passivity could suddenly be replaced by the most brutal reprisals. Besides, I could not bear to realize that the enemy might stay in the city even one extra day, when there were forces at hand to drive him out of it. And lastly, I did not at all wish to see anarchy arise in the capital as a result of the unrest. From the report of Pierre Minette, who was in charge of the supply of Paris, it was clear that the food situation in the city is critical. The capital, for several weeks cut off from the entire country, was virtually doomed to starvation. Minette reported that in some places the last food stores and stores had begun to be smashed, and that if the police did not take up their duties, the most serious riots were to be expected. Nevertheless, even on this day, which was drawing to a close, the Allied command did not give General Leclerc an order to commence the offensive. From Rennes, I wrote to General Eisenhower. I informed him of what I had learned of the situation in Paris and asked him to move French and Allied troops on the city as soon as possible, pointing out to what serious consequences, even in terms of military operations, could lead to the emergence of unrest in the capital. On August 22, Koenig handed him my letter with appropriate additions from himself, then returned to London, from where he could more easily keep in touch with the resistance than from our mobile camp. For his part, Juin went to see General Patton, who was pursuing the Germans on the main line. I myself also left Rennes, having first ascertained that the Commissaire de la République, having requisitioned trucks and mobilized chauffeurs, could proceed to send food to Paris. Through Alençon, excited, all coloured with flags, I first headed for Laval. On my arrival at the prefecture, where I was met by Michel Desbret, Commissary of the Republic, I received an officer with a letter from General Leclerc. The latter informed me that he had not yet received instructions as to the mission before him, and that he had sent, on his own initiative, a vanguard under Major Gilbon to communicate with Paris. I hastened to approve of his actions, not failing to mention that Eisenhower promised me to move it to Paris, that Koenig for this purpose is under the Commander-in-Chief, that there went and Juin, and finally, that I expect to see him tomorrow, Leclerc himself, to personally give him the appropriate instructions. I soon learned that the very minute I was writing to Leclerc, General Gero was reprimanding him for having sent a detachment to Paris, and ordering him to recall Major Gilbon back immediately. Finally, a few hours after he had read my letter, General Eisenhower gave the order to send the 2nd Armoured Division to Paris. I must say that the information that came almost continuously from the capital, in particular those reported to General Bradley Cocteau and Dr. Monod Gay, confirmed the correctness of my intervention, and moreover, the General Staff already knew how Laval's attempt had ended. All that night, during which Leclerc was preparing to speak, I received reports at the prefecture of Le Mans saying that in Paris events were unfolding with rapidity. I thus learned that on the morning of August 20 the town hall had been occupied by a detachment of the French police under the command of Roland Pré-Leo Amon. The prefect of the department of the Seine, Fleuret, was preparing to assume his duties. But I was also informed that Peroda and Chaban-Delmas, on the one hand, and the majority of the Resistance Council, on the other, warned by American and British agents that it would be a long time. It was even said to be more than a week before the Allied troops entered the capital. Knowing how poorly armed the partisans were compared to the 20,000 soldiers, 80 tanks, 60 guns, 60 airplanes, and wishing to save the bridges over the Seine, the destruction of which Hitler had ordered, as well as to spare the death of political prisoners and prisoners of war, decided to agree to the proposals of Nordling, Consul General of Sweden, and through him to conclude an armistice with General von Holtitz, commander of German troops in Paris and the suburbs. This news, I must confess, made a very unpleasant impression on me, especially as the military situation at the moment when I learned of the armistice did not at all compel such a measure, since General Leclerc had already moved towards the capital. On the morning of August 23rd, however, on leaving Le Mans, I learned that the truce had been greeted with bayonets by the majority of the resistance fighters and had been only partially observed. It is true that it had been won by Paradis and Roland Pré, who had been detained by the Germans on the Boulevard Saint-Germain and released after they had been received by Holtitz himself. Moreover, I was informed that the fighting had resumed on the evening of August 21, that the prefectures, ministries and town halls were still in our hands, that the Parisians were everywhere erecting barricades, and that the German general, while continuing to defend his strongholds resolutely, was not, however, proceeding to reprisals. What was the reason for this delicacy? Fear of tomorrow, the desire to preserve Paris, or an arrangement with the Allies, whose agents had penetrated even his general's staff, after the Gestapo had left the capital? I could not understand it, but I was convinced that help would in any case arrive in time. No one doubted this all the way to my destination on August 23. As I passed between two rows of banners fluttering in the wind, under which people stood shouting, "Long live de Gaulle," I felt a wave of joy sweep over me. At Further-Bernard, at Nogent-le-Rotrou, at Chartres, as in all the towns and villages through which I passed, I had to stop, accept the homage of all these people, and address them in the name of a revived France. In the afternoon, having overtaken the columns of the 2nd Armoured Division, I arrived at the chateau of Rambouillet. On the road I received a note from General Leclerc, informing me that he would meet me in the town. I immediately summoned him to me. He had the plan of attack ready. The bulk of his division, which had left Argentan, would come, however, only by nightfall, but its advanced units had already reached the line of Athis Mons, Palaiseau, Touzy, Noble, Trappy, and came into contact with a well-entrenched, determined enemy. It was necessary to break through this line of defence. The main blow fell on the share of the grouping of Billet, which was to move on the road from Orleans to Paris through Antony. Grouping Langlade will go through Toucy-le-Noble and Clamart, while the detachment under the command of Morel-Devil will cover it from Versailles. As for Diau's group, temporarily withdrawn to the reserve, it will advance following Bayeux. The operation will begin tomorrow at dawn. I approved the plan and suggested Leclerc on entering Paris to arrange his command post at Montparnasse station. There I would meet him to make further arrangements. And so, looking at this young commander, already ignited by the flame of the upcoming battle, seeing what opportunities to show his valour provides him with this extraordinary coincidence of circumstances, I saw, "You are lucky," and I thought that in war the honour of the government depends on the luck of generals. Dr. Favreau, who had left Paris in the morning, arrived at Rambouillet by evening. He brought me a report from Louise. According to the prefect of police, the resistance fighters have become masters of the streets of Paris. The Germans are trapped in their strongholds, from where they only occasionally dare to raid in armoured vehicles. And as if to confirm this, London radio reported in the evening that Paris had been liberated by the forces of the internal resistance. The next day, King George V sent me a congratulatory telegram, which was immediately published. However, both this intimation and the telegram were, of course, premature. And it was done, no doubt, to induce the Americans to abandon their backward thoughts, of which the British disapproved. The discrepancy between the tone of sincere satisfaction with which the BBC reported the events in Paris and the very restrained, even somewhat prickly tone of the Voice of America made me realize that this time there was not complete unanimity between London and Washington about France. I sent the courageous Favreau back to Paris, handing him a reply for Louise, and quite unequivocally declared my intention upon entering the city to go not to the town hall, where the Resistance Council and the Paris Liberation Committee met, but to the centre. In my understanding, this meant the War Ministry, which alone could be the centre of control and French command. This by no means meant that I would not establish contact with the leaders of the Paris uprising, but I wanted to make it clear that the state, after all the upheavals that had failed to either destroy it or bring it to its knees, was returning simply to itself, to its domain. When I read the newspapers' combat, Défense de la France, Frontière, Front National, Humanité Libération, Populaire, which the political elements of the resistance had for 2 days now begun to publish in Paris in place of the newspapers issued by the collaborators, I felt the joy of the spirit of struggle with which they were imbued, and at that time I was even more strengthened in my determination to accept only that power which the voice of the crowd would give me. This is what I said to Alexandre de Saint-Phal, who came to me with a whole delegation, and of whose influence in business circles I was well aware. He arrived accompanied by Jean Laurent, director of the Indochinese Bank, Rolf Nordling, brother of the Swedish Consul General, and the Austrian Baron Popaster, an officer in the German army, Holtitz's adjutant and allied agent. All four left Paris on the night of August 22 to press the American command to bring regular troops into the capital as soon as possible. Having learned from Eisenhower that Leclerc is already on the road, they came to introduce themselves to me. The Seneschal recommended that on my entry into Paris I should immediately call a National Assembly to obtain a vote of confidence from Parliament, which would give my government legitimacy. I flatly refused. At the same time, the composition and the very appearance of such a delegation gave me reason to draw curious conclusions as to the mindset of the German command in Paris. The four envoys were provided with two passes. One was signed by Parodi, and the other by General von Holtitz. Passing through enemy outposts, they heard soldiers muttering treason. 24th in the evening, the bulk of the 2nd Armoured Division after serious fighting approached Paris itself. Biotin Dio took possession of the prison Fran and Croix de Berny, and Langlade took the Sèvres Bridge. A detachment led by Captain Dronet reached the town hall. The whole of the next day was spent in destroying the last points of enemy resistance and suppressing the last strongholds. Leclerc directed Biot's group through the outpost of Gentilly, past the Luxembourg Palace, the Town Hall, the Louvre, to the Hotel Meris, the command post of General von Holtitz. Dio's group entered the city through the Orleans outpost and marched in two columns toward the fortified blockhouses of the École Militaire Supérieure and the Palais Bourbon. Noyer's column marched along the outer boulevards to the Aiguille Viaduct and then up the Seine, and Rouvillois's column moved through Montparnasse and then past the Palais des Invalides. The Place de la Star and the Hotel Majestic were taken up by Langlade's grouping. All three groups met at the Place de la Concorde. The Americans, advancing to the right of Leclerc, directed part of his 4th Division to the Place d'Italie and Austerlitz station. On the 25th of August everything happened as planned. I also decided for myself in advance what I would do in the liberated capital. My role was to unite souls in a single national impulse, and at the same time to immediately show everyone the face and authority of the walking along the Rambillet Terrace and receiving hourly reports on the advance of the 2nd Armoured Division. I thought about how many misfortunes we could have avoided if we had once had a mechanized army of 7 such units at our disposal, and reflecting on the reasons why we did not have such an army and were helpless. In other words, reflecting on the failure of our authorities, I became even more determined not to let myself be tied up like this. My mission seemed very clear to me. As I got into the car to drive to Paris, I felt my throat tighten with excitement, but I was calm. How many people were awaiting my arrival? How many flags on all the houses, from bottom to top? Starting from Longjumeau, the crowd is growing. At Bourg-la-Reine, there's pandemonium. At the Orleans outpost, where they're still shooting, it's already an agitating sea of people. At the Avenue d'Orleans, it's pitch black. Everyone expects me to head for the town hall, but after turning down the Avenue de Meun, almost empty compared with the Avenue d'Orleans, I arrive at Montparnasse station about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. General Leclerc has just arrived there. He informs me of the surrender of General von Holtitz. This latter, after appropriate negotiations through Nordling, has personally surrendered to Major de Lagary, Chief of Staff of Biot. Then, accompanied by the Major, he went to the prefecture and signed there, together with Leclerc, an agreement by which the German strongholds in Paris were to cease resistance. It must be said that many of them had already been captured during the day, and to the rest the German general gave a written order requiring the defenders to lay down their arms and recognize themselves as prisoners of war. Officers from Holtitz's headquarters, accompanied by French officers, set out to announce this to the German troops. Here I saw my son, a Marine lieutenant with the 2nd Armoured Regiment. He was on his way to the Bourbon Palace with a German major to accept the surrender of the garrison. The fighting in Paris is concluding quite well. Our troops have won a complete victory, and the city has suffered no damage and the population no casualties. I congratulate Leclerc. What a step on the road to glory. I also congratulate Roll Tanguy, who I see by his side. After all, it was the internal forces of the resistance that managed in the preceding days to drive the enemy from our streets, emptied his ranks and demoralized the enemy soldiers, blocked his units, surrounding these fortified islets on all sides. In addition, since morning groups of partisans, how poorly armed they were, have been valiantly assisting the regular troops in clearing out the nests of German resistance. More than that, they had eliminated with their own forces the fortified point in the Klinjanker, and yet, when I read the text of the surrender handed to me by Leclerc, I disapproved of the fact that, under pressure from Roltangi, he had inserted there a phrase by which it appeared that the German command had surrendered to Roltangi and to him. In the first place, I declared, that is not accurate. Secondly, you were the senior officer in this operation, and therefore you alone are responsible for it. And most important, the demand that induced you to agree to this revision of the text is prompted by an unacceptable tendency. I let Leclerc read the proclamation issued that morning by the National Council of the Resistance, which spoke in the name of the French nation, without a word about the government or General de Gaulle. Leclerc understood at once. I kissed my glorious comrade in arms with all my heart. Leaving the Montparnasse station, I proceeded to the War Ministry. I was preceded by a small vanguard under the command of Colonel de Chevinet. The cortege turned out very modest. 4 cars, mine, Nitrequer's car, and an armoured car. We had intended to go down the Boulevard des Invalides to Rue Saint-Dominique. But near the Rue Saint-François-Xavier, we came under fire from the surrounding houses. We decided to turn back and drove on along the Rue Varneau and the Rue Bourgogne. At 5 o'clock, we arrived at the place. Immediately, I was seized with the feeling that here, among these venerable walls, everything remained as before. A gigantic event had shaken the world. Our army was destroyed. France was almost lost. But at the War Ministry, outwardly, in the courtyard, a platoon of Republican guards saluted us, as they had done before. The lobby, the stairs, the ornamental armour, everything is the same as before. And here are the sentries who stood at the entrance even then. I enter the minister's office that Paul Reynaud and I left together on the night of June 10, 1940. Not a single chair, not a single rug, not a single drape is untouched. There is a telephone on the table, in the same place, and next to the call buttons are all the same names. Now they will tell me that this is the case in other buildings where the Republic is victoriously entering. Everything is in place, only the state is missing, and it is my duty to bring it here. That is why I am here. Louise appears to give me a report, then Paroli. They are both radiant with happiness, but at the same time anxious and exhausted, for they have known neither sleep nor rest for a week. They have 2 problems before them above all: the restoration of public order and supplies. They described to me the irritation that the Resistance Council and the Paris Liberation Committee had been caused by the news that I had not gone to them first. I explained the reasons again to the Minister Delegate and the Prefect of Police. Now, leaving here, I head for the town hall, but before I do, I stop by the prefecture to greet the Paris police. We work out a plan for these meetings. Then I map out the route for tomorrow's march, which makes Paradis and Louise both excited and anxious at the same time. After they leave, I receive a dispatch from General Koenig. He could not accompany me on this great day. The fact is that in the morning Eisenhower asked him to come to sign an agreement governing the relationship between our administration and the Allied command. Finally, better late than never. At 7 o'clock this evening, I'm inspecting the Paris police in the courtyard of the prefecture, looking at these soldiers who were forced to serve under the occupiers and now rejoice with happiness and pride, and realize that by giving the signal to fight and the first to engage the enemy, the police as if taking revenge for years of humiliation. And besides, it was impossible to miss such an opportunity to increase their prestige and popularity. I told them that. There was a cheer from the ranks. And so, on foot, accompanied by Parodi, Le Troquier, Duin and Louise, I made my way with difficulty through the crowd that surrounded us on all sides, deafening us with shouts of welcome, to the town hall. In front of the building, a detachment of the Resistance's internal forces, under the command of Major Leperque, is immaculately rendering the prescribed honours. At the foot of the stairs, General de Gaulle is greeted by Georges Bidault, André Tallet, and Marcel Fleuret. Resistance fighters stand on the steps and salute with tears in their eyes. To a thunder of cheers, I am led to the middle of the first-floor hall. Members of the National Council of the Resistance and the Paris Liberation Committee are gathered here. Their associates are crowded around, many of them wearing on their sleeves the insignia of the internal resistance forces, as it had been established by government decree. All are wearing the Cross of Lorraine. As I look around this assembly of enthusiastic, friendly, interesting people, I feel that we recognized each other at once, that we are all participants in one great struggle, connected by an inseparable thread, and that if there is a difference of opinion that makes them wary, as well as ambition, it is enough for me to meet the masses for our unity to triumph over everything else. I must say that, in spite of the fatigue reflected on their faces, in spite of the nervous excitement caused by the dangers and past events, I do not see a single gesture or hear a single word that goes beyond the dignified. How wonderful has this meeting turned out, which we have dreamed of for so long, and for which we have paid with so much effort, suffering, and death. Feelings have had their say. Now it was the turn of politics, and it, too, has spoken nobly. Georges Marin, who has replaced André Tolaes, greets me in the most exquisite terms on behalf of the new Paris municipality. Georges Bidault then addresses me in a heartfelt speech. In my impromptu reply, I speak of the sacred excitement that overwhelms us all, men and women, in these moments, far beyond our poor lives. I declare that Paris was liberated by the population itself, with the help of the army and the support of all France. I do not forget to mention that we owe this success also to the French troops, who are at this minute advancing in the valley of the Rhône, as well as to the armed forces of our allies. Finally, I call upon the nation to fulfill its duty of participation in the war and to establish the national unity necessary for that purpose. I enter the office of the prefect of the Department of Seine. Marcel Fleuret introduces me to the principal officials of his administration, seeing me heading for the exit. Georges Bidault stops me with an exclamation. General, around you now are the National Council of the Resistance and the Paris Liberation Committee. We ask you to solemnly proclaim the Republic before those assembled. I answered him, the Republic has never ceased to exist. It has been epitomized alternately by Free France, by Fighting France, by the French Committee for National Liberation. The Vichy regime has always been and remains a nullity and a fiction. I myself am President of the Cabinet of the Republic. So why should I proclaim it? And going to the window, I gestured to the crowd that flooded the square and confirmed by their shouts that they demanded nothing different from me. Thereupon I returned to the Rue Saint-Dominique. In the evening Leclerc gave me an account of the fighting in Paris. All the German strongholds had now surrendered. The last to cease fire was the so-called Block of Luxembourg, which included the Luxembourg Palace, the School of Mines and Lycée M. Montegin, as well as the block of the Place de la République, which occupied the barracks of Prince Eugene and the central telephone exchange on the Rue des Archives. Our troops took 14,800 prisoners of war during that day. There were 3,200 Germans killed, not counting those, and there were at least 1,000 whom the partisans had destroyed during the preceding days. The losses suffered by the 2nd Armoured Division amount to 28 officers and 600 soldiers. As for the internal forces of the resistance, Prouoff, Valérie Raydo, who heads the health service in Paris, estimates that the battles fought by these forces during the last 6 days have cost them 2,500 men. In addition, over 1,000 civilians have been killed. Leclerc has brought to my attention that north of Paris, the pressure of the enemy is still being felt. At Saint-Denis at La Villette, soldiers refused to lay down their arms, saying that they did not obey Holtitz. Part of the German 47th Division is preparing to occupy Le Bourget and Montmorency, apparently to cover the retreat of the troops fighting their way northward. The enemy is still in some places on the approaches to the capital. General Guerreau, commanding the 5th American Corps, which is still attached to the 2nd Armoured Division, has instructed General Leclerc to engage the enemy and attack the German positions. Nevertheless, I am more determined than ever to march tomorrow along the route from Place de la Star to the Cathedral of Our Lady of Paris to meet the people, and I want the 2nd Armoured Division to take part in the ceremony. Organizing such a procession, of course, involves some risk, but it's worth taking. In addition, it seems to me extremely unlikely that the German rear guard suddenly turned into vanguards and headed for the centre of Paris while the entire garrison is taken prisoner. But just in case, it does not hurt to take known precautions. I agree with Leclerc that the tactical group headed by Rumiancive tomorrow will be sent to cover Le Bourget. It will gather around itself scattered detachments of internal forces operating in the area. The rest of the division decided for the duration of the procession divided into 3 groups, which will stand ready respectively at the Arc de Triomphe on the Rhône-Pointy, on the Champs-Élysées and in front of the cathedral, so that if necessary they can be sent to the right place. Leclerc himself, being among my entourage, will keep in constant communication with these groups. since the Allied command did not find it necessary to establish any communication with me, authorized Leclerc to inform the Allies of the plan of action I adopted. In addition, the command has all the necessary means to reinforce, if necessary, one or another part of the French division, in case the Allies give Leclerc instructions contrary to my instructions. He must reply that he will act in accordance with the orders of General de Gaulle. Saturday morning, August 26th. It made no change in my plans. I knew, of course, that Jarrow had demanded that Leclerc and his troops should not take part in the march. The American general had even sent an officer to warn me personally. Needless to say, I paid no attention to these warnings. But I thought to myself that such a position taken on such a day, and in such a place, in accordance, of course, with instructions received from above, showed a complete lack of understanding of what was going on. I must admit that, apart from this attempt, fruitless and unpleasant, our allies have in no other way interfered in the affairs of the capital. General Koenig, who has assumed the duties of military governor, a post to which I appointed him as early as August 21, the prefect of the Seine, the prefect of police, cannot point to a single instance of interference with their rights. There is not a single American unit in Paris, and the soldiers who passed through the city the day before in the neighborhood of the Place d'Italie and the Gare de Lyon immediately left the capital. Except for reporters and photographers, the Allies will take no part at all in the planned march. There will be only French women and Frenchmen all along the route. But there will be a lot of them. Already the night before, the radio, the work of which Jean Guimbert, Pierre Crenesse and their assistants are trying hard to establish, begins to announce the upcoming ceremony. Throughout the morning, I am constantly informed that from all corners of the city and from the suburbs to the centre of Paris, where the metro is inactive, where there are no buses or cars, countless crowds of pedestrians flock to the centre. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I pull up to the Arc de Triomphe. Standing around the tomb of the unknown soldier are Parodi and Les Traqueurs, members of the government, Bidault and the National Council of the Resistance, Tallez and the Paris Liberation Committee, Generals Juin, Koenig, Leclerc, Vallin, Bloch de Soult, Admiral d'Argentieu, the prefects of Floret and Lioise, the representative of the military authorities, Chaban Delmas, and a multitude of commanders and men of the internal forces. I salute the Chad Territory Regiment, lined up in battle order in front of the Arc de Triomphe. The officers and soldiers standing on their tanks, watching me pass by, heading for the Place de la Star, is like a dream come true. I'm stoking the eternal flame. After June 14, 1940, no one could do that, for there were invaders all around. Then I step out from under the shadow of the arch. The people present step aside. In front of me are the Champs-Élysées, but it's not fields, it's a sea. Huge crowds stand on both sides of the avenue. There are perhaps 1 million or 2 souls here. The rooftops are black with people. People are huddled at all the windows, faces intermingled with banners, ladders, antennas, lanterns. As far as the eye can see, everywhere around is a living sea, swaying under the sun, flanked by tricolor banners. I'm on foot. Today is not a review of the troops when weapons flash and fanfares sound. Today it is to restore the people to their identity, so that they, seeing their own joy and the proof of their freedom, may find themselves again. To the people who yesterday were crushed by defeat and fragmented by slavery. Since everyone, and for those who are here now, holds Charles de Gaulle in their hearts as a refugee from trouble, and as a symbol of hope, it is necessary that all these people should see him. Such a familiar dear man, and national unity will then shine with an even brighter light. It is true that some general staffs are very concerned. What if enemy tanks break through, or a squadron of airplanes comes and drops bombs or machine guns on the gathered people? Because it can lead to great casualties and sow panic. But this evening I believe in the luck of France. It's true that the police fear that they will not be able to contain the crowd. I think the people will behave in a disciplined manner. It is true that the cortege of dignitaries accompanying me is illegally joined by extras from the outside, but no one is looking at them. It is also true that neither my appearance nor my gestures, nor my postures nor my tastes are designed to please those assembled, but I'm sure they don't expect me to. And so I walk, excited and at the same time calm, among a crowd whose jubilation is impossible to describe, accompanied by the thunder of voices shouting my name, trying to catch a glimpse of every wave of this human tide, to absorb all these faces, raising and lowering my hands every now and then in response to greetings. This is the moment when a miracle happens, when national consciousness is awakened, when France makes one of those gestures that shine its light on our centuries-old history. In this unity, when everyone's thoughts become one common thought, when everyone has one impulse, one cry, differences are erased. People as individuals cease to exist. All this multitude of Frenchmen whom I pass by in the Place de la Star, in the Rhone-Pointy, in the Place de la Concorde, in front of the town hall, on the cathedral porch. If they only knew how alike they all are, you children with your poor faces, trembling and loudly expressing your joy. You women who have suffered so much grief and now give me shouts of welcome and smiles. You men, filled with long-forgotten pride, shouting their thanks to me. You old men, honouring me with your tears, how alike you all are, and I am in the midst of this storm. I feel that I have been entrusted with a mission far beyond what I deserve, a mission to be an instrument of destiny. But there is no joy that nothing dims, even when one is walking the path of victory. To the happy thoughts crowding my brain, there are many worries. I know very well that all France wants nothing more than freedom. The thirst for revival, which flared up yesterday in Rennes and Marseilles, and which today overflows into Paris, will be manifested tomorrow in Lyons, Rouen, Lille, Dijon, Strasbourg, Bordeaux. To one who has eyes and ears, there can be no doubt that the country wants to rise from its knees, but the war goes on, and it must still be won. What price will ultimately be paid for this? What destruction will be added to our destruction? What new casualties will our soldiers suffer? What moral and physical suffering will French prisoners of war still have to endure? How many Frenchmen deported to foreign lands? The bravest, the most brave, the most suffering, the most praiseworthy will return. And finally, in what condition will our whole nation find itself, and what will be the world in which it will have to live? It is true that around me I see extraordinary manifestations of unity. It is therefore to be hoped that by the end of the fighting, the nation will have overcome the contradictions that tear it apart. That the French, having come to know each other, will want to remain united in order to revive the power of their country. That, having chosen a goal for themselves and found a leader, they will create institutions that will lead them to that goal. I cannot, however, ignore the stubbornness of the communists, the bitterness of many prominent figures who will not forgive me for knowing their mistakes. Nor can I ignore the agitational itch that is once again tearing the parties apart. Walking at the head of the motorcade, even now I feel escorted not only by loyalty but also by ambition. From beneath the waves of popular confidence, the reefs of politics show up now and then. With every step I take, treading the most molten places of the world, it seems to me that the glory of the past seems to join, as it were, the glory of today. Beneath the Arc de Triomphe, a flame bursts merrily in our honour. Before us opens the shining avenue along which the victorious army marched 25 years ago. Clemenceau, to whom I salute as I pass his monument, seems ready to leap from his pedestal and join us. The chestnut trees on the Champs-Élysées, dreamed of by the captive eagle, and which for so many decades have witnessed the fortunes and rising prestige of the French, now appear in joyous rows before the gaze of thousands of spectators. The Tuileries witness to the greatness of the country under 2 emperors and 2 kings. The Place de la Concorde and the Place de la Carrousel, where the revolutionary enthusiasm swelled to its full breadth and the review of victorious regiments took place. The streets and bridges to which the victorious battles gave their names. On the other side of the scene, the Palais des Invalides, whose glittering dome recalls the splendour of the Sun King. The tomb of Turenne, Napoleon, Foch, the Institut de France, through which so many brilliant minds passed, all look favourably on the human stream that flows around them. Then the Louvre, through which the long line of kings who created France has passed, joins the festivities. Here on their pedestals are the statues of Joan of Arc and Henry of Eve. Here is the palace of Louis the Saint, and finally the Cathedral of Our Lady of Paris, where Paris prays, and sight is its cradle. The history breathed by these stones and these squares seems to smile upon us, but at the same time it warns us. After all, this very site was once Lutetia, flooded by Kezir's legions, and then became Paris, which only Genevieve's prayer saved from fire and Attila's sword. Louis the Saint, a crusader forsaken by all, died in the sands of Africa. At the outpost of St. Honore, Joan of Arc was prevented from entering the city. She returned to France. Very near here, Henry IV fell victim to fanatical hatred. The revolt of the League against Henry IT, the bloody massacre of Bartholomew's Night. The conspiracy of the Fronde, and the tumultuous maelstrom of August 10 stained the walls of the Louvre with blood. In the Place de la Concorde, the heads of the King and Queen of France fell. The Tuileries witnessed the collapse of the decrepit monarchy, the departure into exile of Charles X and Louis Philippe, the despair of the Empress, and then was turned to ashes, like the old town hall. And what ruinous confusion reigned most recently in the Bourbon Palace. 4 times in the memory of 2 generations the Champs-Élysées have been desecrated by an invader who marched solemnly across them to the sound of hateful fanfares. Tonight Paris, illuminated by the grandeur of France's past, is at the same time learning a lesson from her hard days. At 5:30, as scheduled, I will enter under the vaults of the Cathedral of Our Lady of Paris. Just then, in the Rue de Rivoli, I got into the car, and after a short stop at the entrance of the town hall, arrived at the square in front of the porch. The Cardinal Bishop does not meet me at the entrance, and not because he doesn't want to. The new authorities have asked him to refrain from doing so. The fact is that Monsignor Seward 4 months ago found it necessary to organize a solemn meeting for Marshal Pétain, passing through German-occupied Paris, and last month at the behest of Vichy served the funeral service for Philippe Henriot. Therefore, many resistance fighters would be outraged if the same clergymen were now introducing General de Gaulle into the cathedral. I personally, knowing that the Church feels obliged to accept the established order, not doubting that faith and charity occupy the Cardinal's soul, not allowing him to reflect on the temporal nature of certain phenomena, I personally would willingly disregard it, but many are still so excited after the recent fighting that, wishing to avoid any act unpleasant to Monsignor Seward, I decided to agree with my entourage, who asked the Cardinal to sit in the archbishopric and not show his face during the ceremony. What happened afterward only confirmed that this measure was the right one. No sooner had I gotten out of the car than shots rang out, and the shooting started. Everyone who had a gun started shooting at everything. Just in case, they're aiming at the roofs. Resistance fighters shooting in all directions. I can even see soldiers of the 2nd Armoured Division standing at the portal, shooting bullets at the cathedral's turrets. I immediately thought that here must have been one of those cases of mass psychosis, when some inadvertent or deliberate shot causes indiscriminate firing among agitated soldiers. I cannot be allowed to be caught up in this maelstrom, and so I enter the cathedral. Since there is no electricity, the organ is silent. There are shots coming from the street. I walk down the aisle, and those present, bent over their prayer books, announce the vaults with cheers. I sit down. Behind me sit my 2 ministers, Lee Troker and Paradis. The canons stand in their seats. The Reverend Father Bro, coming up to me, conveys the Cardinal's greeting, as well as his regret at what has happened. I ask him to assure His Eminence of my respect for the affairs of religion, to convey to him my desire for the reconciliation of the whole nation, and my intention to accept it soon. The words of a religious hymn are heard under the arches of the cathedral. Has it ever been sung with greater fervour? And the firing continues unabated. A few young men on the upper galleries are firing. Not a single bullet buzzed past me, but from the shots directed upwards, plaster falls from the vault, bullets ricochet off and fall downwards. Men change the police, whom the prefect sends to the top of the building, find a number of armed men there. These latter claim to have fired on the enemy, and although the clergy, the officials, and those present hold themselves blameless, I stop the ceremony. Around the cathedral the shooting has ceased. But when I came out, I was informed that exactly the same events had taken place at this very hour in places as far away from here as the Place de la Star, the Place du Rond-Point, and the Town Hall. There were casualties, almost all as a result of the crush which started the shooting. No investigation has been able to determine that. The assumption that German soldiers or Vichy militia fired from the rooftops seems unlikely. In spite of all the searches, no such men have been apprehended. In addition, it is hard to believe that the enemy fired at the stovepipes and not at me, which would seem easier. After all, I was riding in an open car. You can, if you like, consider it a pure coincidence that the shooting started simultaneously at several points in Paris. But I personally have the feeling that the whole thing was staged by politicians who wanted to take advantage of the confusion of the crowd to justify the need for revolutionary power and emergency measures. By firing a few shots into the air at the hour in question, perhaps without even expecting that a firefight would follow. They wanted to create the impression that a threat lurked somewhere else, that the resistance organizations should remain armed and alert, that the Paris Liberation Committee and the Neighborhood Liberation Committees should take over the functions of police, justice, purge, and thus protect the people from dangerous plots. I, on the other hand, intend above all to restore order. The enemy, by the way, reminds us that war recognizes only its own laws. 500 houses are destroyed. A fire breaks out in the wine rows of the Central Market. About 1,000 people are killed and wounded. Sunday, August 27, was a day of comparative respite for the people of the capital. I had the opportunity, along with thousands of resistance fighters, to attend a service conducted by their priest, Bruckberger, then crammed into a corner of the car so as not to be too conspicuous. I drove around the city to see the faces of the people and to familiarize myself with the general state of affairs. At the same time, the 2nd Armored Division has been engaged in the heaviest fighting all day, from morning until evening. At the cost of significant losses, Grouping Dio manages to seize the airfield Le Bourget, and Langlade Grouping takes the Battle of Sten, Pierrefitte, Montmagny, just as the beam of a searchlight suddenly brings a monument out of the darkness. So the liberation of Paris, accomplished by the French themselves, as well as the proof of the people's confidence in de Gaulle, dispels the shadows that were still enveloping the life of our nation. Somehow, whether as a result of this or as a result of pure coincidence, a certain shift takes place and many obstacles that were still standing in the way disappear. August 28th brings me a whole series of pleasant news. First, I learned that after the occupation of Gonesse by our troops, the Germans began to retreat from the northern suburbs, which means the end of the battle for Paris. Then Juin brings me reports from the First Army confirming the surrender of the enemy garrisons, on August 22 in Toulon and on August 23 in Marseilles. It is reported that our forces from different parts of the Rhône Valley are advancing rapidly toward Lyons, while the Americans, following the Napoleon Road cleared by the guerrillas, have already reached Grenoble. Moreover, from the reports of our delegates south of the Loire, Bénouville in the massive central and General Pester in the southwest, I learn that the Germans are retreating there as well. Some units are trying to withdraw into Burgundy to avoid encirclement, while others are huddled in fortified areas on the Atlantic coast. Both are retreating with fighting, as internal forces are constantly attacking their columns and raiding their troop locations. Borges Manuri, our delegate in the southeast, reports that the partisans are masters of the situation in the Alps, in the departments of Aisne, Drôme, Ardèche, Cantal, Pays-de-Dôme, and this naturally hastens the advance of the troops of Generals Patch and Delay. Finally, in the east and north of the country, the activity of our forces is increasing, while in the Ardennes, in Hainaut, in Brabant, the Belgian resistance units are also engaged in tireless guerrilla warfare. It can be assumed that the enemy, driven back to the Seine, pursued along the Rhône, attacked everywhere on our soil, will gather strength only at the very border of the Rake. This means that our country, whatever the wounds inflicted on it, will soon enough have the opportunity to be reborn as a nation, provided that it is governed, which excludes the existence of any power parallel to mine. The iron is hot. On the morning of August 28, I summoned 20 of the principal leaders of the Paris partisans to meet them, congratulate them, and put them on notice that I intend to infuse internal forces into the ranks of the regular army. The secretaries general then enter, who make it clear that they await instructions only from me and my ministers. Then I receive the members of the Bureau of the National Council of the Resistance. These men are at the mercy of two feelings which I perceive in different ways. They are proud of what they have done, and here I am entirely on their side. And some have secret agendas for the leadership of the state, which I cannot accept. Although the popular demonstration of August 26 definitively revealed the priority of General de Gaulle, there are those who still cherish the plan of creating an autonomous authority existing in parallel with him and independent of him, intending to turn the National Council of the Resistance into a permanent body controlling the actions of the government, to entrust Comac with the leadership of the military forces of the resistance, and to designate from the ranks of the latter the so-called patriotic militia, which will act on behalf of the people in a certain sense of the word. Moreover, the Council had already adopted a program of the National Council of the Resistance, listing the activities to be carried out in all fields, a program intended to be waved continuously in front of the nose of the executive body. Recognizing and appreciating the role that my interlocutors have played in the struggle, I do not, however, in any way conceal my intentions concerning them. From the moment Paris is wrested from the hands of the enemy, The National Council of the Resistance is inscribed in the glorious annals of the history of liberation, but has no longer any reason to exist as an effective body. All responsibility for the future rests with the government. I shall, of course, include one or other of the members of the council, but in that case these latter will have to renounce all solidarity with any body other than the cabinet. On the contrary, I envisage merging the council into the consultative assembly, which will come from Algiers and must be enlarged. As for the internal forces, they are part of the French army. As they emerge from the underground, the War Ministry will take custody of the personnel and weapons of the guerrillas. Comac must cease to exist. Public order will be maintained by the police and gendarmerie, who will be assisted by garrison troops if necessary. The militia is no longer needed. It must be dissolved. I read out to my interlocutors the order I had signed for the incorporation of the internal forces into the regular forces. General Koenig, the military governor, was thereby charged with the responsibility of carrying out the necessary arrangements in Paris. After listening to the remarks of the members of the Bureau, some of them submissive, others passionately opposed, I conclude the meeting. The conclusion I have reached leads me to suppose that some will still try to play on misunderstandings in order to keep as many armed men at their disposal as possible, that official measures will have to be resorted to, friction will have to be overcome, orders will have to be enforced, before the authority of the government is finally established. I want the way to this to be cleared as soon as possible, and this will henceforth be facilitated by the Americans. General Eisenhower pays me a visit. We congratulate each other on the happy ending of events in Paris. I do not hide from him, however, that I was extremely uncomfortable with the position taken by Gero at a time when I, having entered my own capital, want to master the position. I bring it to the attention of the Commander-in-Chief that for reasons relating to public morale, and therefore in the interest of establishing the present order, I will leave the 2nd Armoured Division in command for a few more days. Eisenhower says he intends to settle with his headquarters at Versailles. I approve of his decision. It seems right to me that he does not want to stay in Paris, and reasonable that he decided to settle near the city. We say goodbye, and on behalf of the French government I express to this magnanimous and intelligent allied commander our respect, confidence, and gratitude. Shortly afterward, the Americans, without consulting anyone, issued a communique according to which the military command, in accordance with the agreement reached, allegedly transferred its powers to the French administration. Naturally, no powers were transferred by the Allies, for one cannot transfer what one has never possessed or used, but the President's ambition must have made its own demands here, especially since the election campaign was beginning in the United States, and that in a month and a half a general vote would decide the fate of Franklin Roosevelt. As evening falls, I learn of the Marshal's last act as head of state. Due in brings me a letter from Admiral Alphen, a former Vichy minister. Attached to the letter is a memorandum, in which the Admiral puts me on notice of a mission he has received from the Marshal and formulated in 2 secret documents. The first of these documents is the so-called Constitution Act of September 27, 1943, authorizing a 7-member board to perform the duties of head of state in case the Marshal himself is unable to perform them. The second, dated August 11, 1944, authorizes Admiral Orpan, if necessary, to make contact on behalf of the Marshal with General de Gaulle in order, at the moment of liberation of the territory of the country, to choose a course for French policy that would prevent the outbreak of civil war, and reconcile among themselves all peoples of good will. Should Orpan fail to contact him, the Marshal trusts him to act as he deems most expedient for the interests of the fatherland, but only, he adds, on condition that the principle of legality, of which I am the bearer, is respected. In his letter, the Admiral informed me that on August 20, when he learned that the Germans had taken the Marshal away, he immediately tried to convene a board, but 2 of its members, Weygand and Boutillier, were arrested and held in Germany. Another, Leon Noel, French ambassador, already 4 years in the ranks of the resistance, officially refused to take part in such a combination. 2 others, Porcher, vice president of the Council of State, and Guedel, rector of the University of Paris, simply did not come. Seeing that no one showed up except him and Carl, the Attorney General of the Court of Cassation, Orpan decided that the Collegium had outlived its time before it was born, and that henceforth he was the chief executor of the Marshal's legitimate powers. He asks me to accept this démarche did not surprise me in the least. As far as I know, as early as the beginning of August, the Marshal, who was expecting the Germans to force him to go to Germany any minute now, made contact with the leaders of the resistance. Henry Ingrand, Commissioner of the Republic at Clermont-Ferrand, brought to my attention that on August 14 he had been visited, on the Marshal's instructions, by Captain Olliol. The Marshal reported his readiness to entrust his person to the protection of the internal forces, and at the same time to declare his renunciation of power. Ingrand replied that, if the Marshal surrendered to him, the internal forces would ensure his safety. But all probability he was prevented by the measures taken by the Germans, who increased surveillance of him before sending to Belfort and Sigmaringen. And now the Marshal's confidant notifies me that he wishes to negotiate with me officially. What an end! What a confession! So, at the moment of Vichy's collapse, Philippe Pétain turned to Charles de Gaulle. This is how this disgusting series of capitulations ended, leading to the acceptance of slavery under the pretext of saving property. How immeasurable is the depth of the fall when such a policy is resorted to at the end of his years by a military leader who once covered himself with glory. As I read the documents which I have been handed in his name, I feel myself once more confirmed in what I have always been sure of. And at the same time my soul is clenched with unspeakable sadness. Mr. Marshal, you once covered our weapons with such glory. You once were my chief and served as an example to me, and what have you come to? Well, what can I say to this letter? In this case, sentiment trumps national considerations. The Marshal speaks of civil war. If he means by that a sharp clash between the two parts of the French people, nothing of the kind is imminent. The fact is that none of his supporters oppose my authority. In the liberated territory there is not a single department, not a single town, not a single commune, not a single official, not a single soldier, not even a single private individual who would try to oppose de Gaulle out of loyalty to Pétain. As for the repressive measures that individual resistance groups might take against people who persecuted them in order to please the enemy, the appropriate authorities must intervene, without forgetting, however, that justice must be observed. Nothing can be agreed upon in advance. More importantly, the ground on which Pétain invokes in proposing to enter an agreement with me makes such an agreement impossible. The government of the Republic flatly denies him the right to call himself the bearer of legitimate authority, not only because he had at one time accepted the abdication of a parliament mad with fear, but also because he had agreed to give France into slavery, had officially collaborated with the invaders, had ordered to fight against French and Allied soldiers fighting for liberation, and at the same time there had never been a day when he had authorized firing on the Germans. More than that, neither in his letter to Ofontaine nor in his farewell address to the French, Pétain nowhere condemns the armistice nor call. Forward to the enemy, so here it is lost its independence, cannot be considered a legitimate French government. We Frenchmen, in the course of history, have suffered many troubles, lost provinces, paid reparations, but never has our state tolerated foreign rule. Even the king from Bourges, even the monarchy restored in 1814 and in 1815, or the government and assembly sitting at Versailles in 1871, have not gone along with foreigners. If France recognized a power that would put a yoke upon her, she would forfeit her future. The call that comes from the depths of history, the instinct of the patriot of my country, impels me to take into my hands the treasure that has been left to us as our inheritance. The safeguarding of French sovereignty. I am the bearer of legitimacy, and as such I can call the people to war and to unity, to establish order, law, justice, to demand that the rights of France be respected abroad. Here I will not retreat one step or compromise. I recognize the motives that led the Marshal to write this message. Nor do I doubt the moral importance for the future of the nation of the fact that Pétain ultimately appealed to de Gaulle, and yet I can only answer the Marshal in silence. Moreover now, at night, after such a stormy day, there is finally silence. It is time to take stock of what has been done and to envision the future. Today unity had prevailed. Born in Brazzaville, nurtured in Algeria, it has blossomed in full flower in Paris. And France, which seemed doomed to disaster, to despair and to strife, now has every opportunity to reach the end of the present drama in unity and to emerge victorious with others, regaining its lands, its place, its dignity. It is to be hoped that the French, regrouping now, will remain in this condition for a long time to come and, until they reach their immediate goal, will not break up into the divisive categories which, owing to the difference of their ideals, invariably prevent national cohesion. Having measured the tasks before me, I must also measure my own strengths. My role is to make the heterogeneous elements of the nation serve the common purpose of saving the country. And it is my duty, whatever my shortcomings, to play that role for as long as the crisis lasts, and then, if the country wishes, until its institutions, appropriate to our era and armed with the hard experience of the past, have been established, and then to hand over the leadership of the country to them. I know that as the danger recedes, all factions, all schools, all Areopagi will gradually emerge in my path, revitalized and hostile. There is no such dogmatic current or rebellion, no such personification of inactivity or pretentiousness, no such indifference or interest, which first secretly and then openly would not oppose my undertaking, which has the object of rallying the French around France and of establishing a strong and just state. If it speaks of human affections, solitude would be my lot. But what a mighty lever to lift such a burden is the support of the people. This mighty trust, this simple friendliness, the evidence of which I see at every step, is what will sustain me. And my call was little by little heeded. Slowly, hard unity was created, and now the people and their leader, helping each other, have embarked on the path of salvation.